In 1968, a crew of French restoration workers began dismantling a massive stone pylon at the Temple of Karnak in Upper Egypt, Pylon 9, one of the largest ceremonial gateways ever built by human hands. They expected rubble inside, stone fill, construction debris. That's what you find inside pylons. Loose aggregate, desert sand, maybe broken pottery, standard, unremarkable. What they found instead were walls. Thousands of carved limestone walls, not intact walls, blocks. Tens of thousands of small rectangular limestone blocks, each one roughly half a cubit wide and a cubit long. Each one painted and engraved with scenes of worshippers, hymns, priests, and sun rays extending down like open hands. And every single one of them had been deliberately stripped of a name, not damaged, not eroded by time, deliberately, carefully, surgically erased. By the time the excavation was complete, more than 100,000 of these blocks had been cataloged from the pylons and foundations of Karnak alone. Of those, roughly 40,000 were still decorated on at least one face. When scholars began photographing and reassembling them, like an impossible puzzle spread across an entire civilization, they realized they were looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist. They were looking at the dismantled temples of a pharaoh, so despised by his successors that they didn't simply tear down his monuments. They turned them into the foundations of new ones. They hid his entire religion inside the walls of Egypt's most sacred precinct and buried it under 3,000 years of silence. Most people walk right past it, but hidden inside those blocks, inside the stones that propped up Horemheb's pylon for 3 millennia, is something that shouldn't exist. A record, a theological document that may predate the oldest surviving texts of monotheistic religion by at least 3 centuries. Not a myth, not a metaphor. A literal architectural archive, sealed inside stone, deliberately buried and waiting. If you're new here, subscribe now, because this channel covers the ancient stories mainstream history still hasn't finished telling. The blocks are called talatat. The name comes from the Arabic word for 3 because each one measures 3 hand widths long. They were cut to a standardized size during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, the man who later renamed himself Akhenaten, around 1353 BCE. The blocks were part of a radical construction project. Right inside the sacred precinct of the god Ammon at Karnak, Akhenaten built temples to a rival deity, the Aten, the solar disk. Not the sun as a person, not Ra with his falcon head and his throne, not Horus, simply the Aten, the light itself, the energy that falls from the sky and makes all life possible. Akhenaten's theology was startling in its simplicity. There is one God. It does not have arms or a body or a myth. It is light, and it sustains everything that lives. For approximately 17 years, this was the state religion of the most powerful empire on earth. Then, Akhenaten died, and Egypt tried to erase him. Pharaoh Horemheb, the military general who rose to power after Akhenaten's dynasty collapsed, launched one of the most systematic damnatio memoriae campaigns in ancient history, the deliberate erasure of a person from the record. Akhenaten's name was chiseled from every monument in Egypt. His temples were dismantled, block by block. His statues were broken apart. The city he had built in the desert, Akhenaten, modern Tel El Amarna, was abandoned and partially razed. His religion was declared heresy. His successors were stricken from the official king lists. For more than 3,000 years, the world did not know he had ever existed. Before the erasure, Akhenaten composed a hymn. We call it the Great Hymn to the Aten. It was inscribed on the walls of a tomb at Amarna, the tomb of a court official named Ai, who later became pharaoh himself after Tutankhamun's death. The hymn survives because that tomb was carved into solid limestone and could not be easily dismantled block by block. You can't erase a cliff face as simply as you can a temple wall. The text describes the Aten as the singular source of all life. It describes night as the withdrawal of the Aten, when lions emerge and serpents hunt the darkness. It describes dawn as the moment the Aten returns and the world comes alive again. Fish rise in rivers. Birds unfold their wings. Plants grow from the soil. The Nile floods to bring green life to the black earth. For decades, scholars interpreted this as religious poetry, spiritual verse, standard ancient Egyptian glorification of a divine force. But that explanation has a problem. In the Old Testament, in the book of Psalms, there is a poem. It is Psalm 104, one of the most beloved passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. It describes light coming to end darkness. It describes the night when lions go out to hunt. It describes the sun rising and people going out to work. It describes the sea and ships crossing it and creatures living in its depths. It describes water brought to the valleys, grass growing for cattle, and the joy of the earth under a creator's hand. The overlap is not thematic. It is structural, sentence by sentence, image by image, sequence by sequence. Not similar, not inspired by it, the same. The great hymn to the Aten dates to approximately 1345 BCE. Psalm 104 is thought to date to somewhere between the 10th and 6th century BCE. That means the Egyptian hymn predates the Hebrew psalm by at least 300 years, and possibly as many as 700. Egyptologist James Henry Breasted noted this parallel in the early 20th century. The standard academic position is that it may represent indirect cultural transfer, that the theology of Akhenaten's solar monotheism somehow diffused into the religious thought of the ancient Near East, eventually surfacing in early Israelite worship. That is a reasonable position. But that explanation has a problem. If this text crossed cultures, it means the ideas of Akhenaten, the pharaoh Egypt spent 3,000 years trying to destroy, were preserved somewhere, transmitted deliberately, carried by someone who understood exactly what they were carrying. The question is, by whom and where they went. Now, the second clue, January 6th, 1907. Valley of the Kings. A British excavator named Edward Ayrton, working for the American lawyer Theodore Davis, broke into an unregistered tomb at the far end of the valley. The tomb was catalogued as KV 55. It was not a standard royal tomb. There was no wealth. The gold name cartouche had been stripped from the coffin. The funerary goods bore the name of Queen Tiye, Akhenaten's mother, but the body inside the coffin was male. The mummy was in poor condition. The bones were partially scattered. Canopic jars were present, but their stoppers had been removed. The seal on the tomb had been broken and resealed. Not once, but apparently more than once. Someone had been inside this tomb after it was originally sealed. Someone had removed specific items. Someone had stripped the name from the coffin. And then they had closed it again, as if they needed it to look undisturbed. For a century, scientists argued over the identity and age at death of the KV-55 skeleton. Some said it was a young man, pointing to Akhenaten's possible co-regent Smenkhkare. Others said skeletal markers suggested a man of 35 to 45 years, which opened the door to Akhenaten himself. Then, modern science found something that changed everything. In 2010, a team led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass published a landmark DNA study in the Journal of the American Medical Association. They had extracted genetic material from 11 royal mummies, including the KV-55 skeleton. The results were specific. The KV-55 individual was confirmed as a son of Amenhotep III and the father of Tutankhamun. That placed him almost certainly as Akhenaten himself. But the DNA also revealed something the study's authors described in careful, measured language. Tutankhamun's parents, identified as Akhenaten and one of his sisters, were full siblings, not cousins, not half-siblings, through different mothers, the same father and the same mother. The consequences were documented in the bones of the boy king himself. Tutankhamun suffered from a cleft palate, clubfoot, bone necrosis, and at least 2 species of malaria. He required a cane to walk. He died at approximately 19 years of age. And here is the third clue, the one that bends the entire investigation. When researchers studied the CT scans and physical remains of the KV-55 skeleton, they found something unexpected. Akhenaten, depicted in art with an elongated skull, protruding jaw, wide hips, distended abdomen, and unmistakably feminine curves, showed none of those physical markers in his actual skeleton. Not one. The bones were within normal anatomical range, no evidence of Marfan syndrome, no evidence of craniosynostosis, no skeletal deformity that matched the radical and distinctive art style of the Amarna period. Which means the art was not documenting his body. It was communicating something else, deliberately, repeatedly, across 17 years of commissioned royal imagery, produced by dozens of artists across an entire civilization. They weren't guessing. They were recording something. Scholars have proposed theological symbolism. The pharaoh depicted as both male and female, embodying the full creative power of the singular Aten. Others point to political intention. Others simply note that no explanation has yet fully satisfied the paradox. What is certain is this: the full raw data of the 2010 DNA study was never released to independent researchers for verification. Requests for third-party genetic analysis have gone unanswered. Access to further testing has been restricted by the Egyptian authorities responsible for the royal mummies. It was sealed, it was studied, and the data stopped there. Now, the most recent development, July 2015. British archaeologist Nicholas Reeves published a paper that quietly stunned the Egyptological world. Using high-resolution scans of the painted walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, the same chamber Howard Carter opened in 1922, Reeves identified linear traces beneath the painted plaster. Not random cracks. Deliberate seams running at regular intervals behind the northern wall of the burial chamber, the structural signature of sealed doorways. He proposed that Tutankhamun's tomb was originally built for someone else, and that behind the north wall, plastered over, painted over, and hidden inside the world's most famous ancient burial site, was an intact chamber, possibly the tomb of Nefertiti herself, Akhenaten's chief wife, the woman who may have ruled Egypt after him, and who carried the theology of the Aten longer than any other figure in the historical record. In November 2015, the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities authorized ground-penetrating radar scans of the walls. A Japanese team announced initial findings indicating a 90% probability of one or more voids behind the plaster, with readings suggesting both metal and organic material on the other side. Then a second team was commissioned. Their data conflicted. The government announcement that followed was carefully worded to the point of opacity. Reeves was not given permission to excavate. Third-party radar specialists who requested access were declined. The north wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber remains sealed. It was scanned, it was mapped, and then it disappeared from the public conversation. Now, does this prove the most extreme version of the story? Probably not. It is possible the radar anomalies were natural voids in ancient limestone. It is possible the seams Reeves identified are structural cracks in 3,000-year-old plaster. It is possible that the parallel between the Aten hymn and Psalm 104 reflects shared regional theology rather than direct transmission. These are legitimate possibilities, and honest investigation requires acknowledging them. But that doesn't make the discovery ordinary, because even in the most conservative reading, the talatat blocks are real. The theological text is real. The KV-55 DNA results were real enough to publish in a peer-reviewed medical journal. The radar scans were real enough that an entire government authorized them and then found reason to stop. And the underlying fact remains. You do not spend 1,000 years chiseling a name off every monument in your civilization, unless you believe what that name represents is genuinely dangerous. Egypt didn't forget Akhenaten. Egypt was afraid of Akhenaten. The erasure was too thorough, too coordinated, too sustained across too many generations to be simple religious politics. Something about what he knew, or what his cult carried, required not just defeat, but total obliteration. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter. A chapter about how the world's oldest surviving monotheistic theology moved from a single desert city on the Nile into the religious foundations of three of the largest civilizations in human history. A chapter about what the Aten cult preserved, encoded, and transmitted before the pylons were filled with limestone and sealed with mortar. That chapter may be behind a plastered wall in the Valley of the Kings, or it may be scattered across 40,000 painted blocks in museum storerooms that have never been fully read, or it may be sitting in an archive, in a drawer, beneath a catalog number that no one has looked at closely enough. The north wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber is still there. The inscriptions are intact, the plaster is undisturbed, and somewhere in the Karnak storerooms, there are talatat blocks that have never been turned over, never photographed on the reverse, never examined for what might be written on the face that spent 3,000 years pressed against rubble and stone. The answer, if it exists, has not been announced, or it has been found, and someone decided the rest of us weren't ready. If this investigation changes the way you see ancient Egypt and the lengths civilization will go to silence what it cannot control, hit like and subscribe. New episodes go deep on the discoveries that official history is still catching up with. And the next video is already waiting. You're going to want to watch it.